He's like, oh my god. Oh. Oh my gosh. How's underground?
It was so, you would love.
I was there.
I was saying,
yeah.
He's so good. I got the s'mores.
Yeah, I had that before. Yeah.
So good.
It was. That one's good.
It was really good. I was like surprised at how good.
Yeah, no one talks about it. I know.
And it was so fast.
Yeah.
I've been to a couple.
I had an extra credit here.
I've been to the film screenings here too. I tried. Yeah. But I wouldn't.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm terrible.
Me? I don't know if they're necessarily just yeah, no, for real.
He just knows. Yeah. Yeah, true. You're right.
Yeah. I was just thinking of modern day things. They're making a that so Raven too.
What?
He went to the football game, so I like that song they played called Rover. I'm like, what? He's like,
I was
and
so
that girl
confused.
next was like, all closer. Like,
Called
more,
Rover.
like,
My jam. They play that at Beaver Stadium.
Oh my god.
I don't know, sometimes I think he's trying to kid, like he's
Oh, I
not.
think so.
Do you think it is a
sometimes.
joke?
I think sometimes.
I think like this has
I
to
think
be a joke.
sometimes he plays stuff.
Yeah.
Because
He wants to get her like. He wants to get her reaction.
She's like so smart, he wants her like not, like
Yeah.
he knows everything, so he just
But
pretends
I
like he
think
doesn't
cancel
know.
culture is very shocking.
It is a shocking.
Like it is shocking.
You
Like
have
it's
to-
appalling.
yeah.
I get that.
Like freshman year, you have to like get used to it. It takes a little. It takes like less time for us to actually learn about it.
I know. Like just a different world.
When he was like, I've never seen girls play ping-pong. I was taken aback.
I was taken
I was
aback by that.
confused. I was
He
like, they
said
don't
it's
do that.
growish. That cracks me.
Yeah, he was like, you throw.
Gross.
I know. He was like, you throw the ball into a cup. That takes like no sense.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt McAllister. I'm a faculty member of the College of Communications. I'd like to welcome you to this fall's Robert M. Pockrass Memorial Lecture. Dr. Pockrass was a member of the Penn State journalism faculty from 1948 to 1977. He was someone who loved to travel, who studied international communication, had interest in popular culture and public opinion. And so in his name, this lectureship has been established, where we bring in esteemed speakers on a variety of topics in communications research, including international communication, public opinion, popular culture, and really a broad range of topics, including this semester's on political communication. Many people have contributed to the Pockrass Lecture Series. We have alum who still give money to the lecture series, and we're very much grateful for that. One of the biggest supporters is Judith Hardis, who's a 1952 Penn State grad who lives in Arizona, and she's been giving money for many years toward this. She knew Dr. Pockrass and appreciated his dedication to the student body and to Penn State. On behalf of the Pockrass Coordination Committee, that's myself, people from last year, that would include Boaz DeVere, Kevin Agopian, Peril Gluck, as well as this year's members, Mary Beth Oliver, Joe Dumas, was on last year and this year, and Matt Jordan. We'd also like to thank others who have made this lectureship possible, including Dean Marie Harden, Joella Martin, Steve Samsel, and Trey Miller of the College of Communications, Anthony Olorunashola, Department Head of Film, Video, and Media Studies, and Jeff Knapp and Cheryl McCallips of University Libraries. And we especially thank University Libraries for letting us use the Foster Auditorium. What I'd like to do now is introduce Juliana Sorche, a doctoral student in mass communication who will introduce this year's Pockrass speaker.
Thank you, Matt. Dr. Dr. Dannagal G. Young is Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Delaware. Her research interests include political media effects, political humor, political satire, and the psychology of political humor. Her work on the role and effects of late-night comedy in the changing political environment has been published in leading communication journals, such as Media Psychology, Political Communication, International Journal of Press Politics, Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media, and Mass Media Society. According to Google Scholar, her research has been cited over 1,000 times. She's also an award-winning teacher, having been recognized with the 2014 University of Delaware Excellence in Teaching Award. In addition, Dr. Young is an improvisational comedian performing regularly in the improv comedy troupe Comedy Sports Philadelphia since 1999. We just had lunch with her and we laughed a lot. Today, Dr. Young will be talking on the promise and peril of political humor as a rhetorical device. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Young.
Thank you so much, Juliana. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you very much to Penn State for having me and to the Pockrass Committee for selecting me as this year's speaker. This is quite an honor to be able to be here with you all and to be able to share my research, particularly at such an interesting time in our nation's political history, in our nation's political history. My goal today is, rather than doing some big, broad, really thin overview of a whole lot of things, I really kind of want to delve in deep into something that's really important to me. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is political humor, the psychology of political humor, and whether or not it can be particularly effective as a rhetorical device, not only in getting us to think about things and getting us interested in things, but can it be an effective rhetorical device to persuade us? So just an overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to try to give you the bare bones of decades of research by humor theorists who really are not a really fun group of people, on how humor is constructed, how it's interpreted in the brain, and why it is so special. I'm going to talk to you about how political humor can affect viewers. And we're going to talk a little bit about the satire processing paradox. This is a name that Heather Lamar has given it. A lot of us have been studying this topic and have found the same thing, which is that there's this odd, seemingly oppositional tension between the fact that satire can get you to pay more attention and be more interested and be more engaged in a message, and yet reduces your ability to scrutinize the arguments that it's presenting. And that really is in contrast to how we process most information, right? So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the unique case of irony, which is a beast to define and an even beastier beast to interpret, which is why it's often misinterpreted. I'm going to talk to you a bit about some recent research I've been doing about political irony as a choice tool of the political left, and why that might be, because that is the question I'm asked most. How do we see satire on the right? I might know why, I'm not totally sure, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on my theory. And then something I'm very interested in right now, which is related to all of these issues, social media's ongoing struggle with how to deal with irony and satire in a newsfeed context. You may have heard that Facebook and Twitter are having all kinds of issues regarding their trending codes and the fact that there are things that will start trending that are news stories that are actually false. They're hoaxes, it's fake news. What role does satire play in that? Can computer algorithms capture those satirical pieces as opposed to the pieces that are just designed to fool people? Is there a distinction to be made? That is an open question, but it's something I find very fascinating. So if I get there, I get there. That's my hope. Okay, so why is humor special other than that it's hilarious and we love it? Why is it so special? Humor, fundamentally, this is where humor becomes unfunny for a little while, until I give examples. Okay? Humor is based on the concept of incongruity. Incongruity is the notion that there are two things that are seemingly incompatible. And the brain has to kind of struggle to make them compatible. And in that struggle, And in the reconciliation of those things is where the humor comes from. It doesn't make that noise always, but it's where the humor comes from. So oftentimes when you're listening to a simple joke, which is where a lot of my examples are simple jokes because they're the easiest to explain in this context, there's what we think of as the read-in or the lead-in to a joke. You start listening to a joke, something is activated in your mind, either a schema or a mental model based on the language and the terminology of the beginning of the joke. And then the joke introduces something that's incongruous. It doesn't seem to have anything in common with the first information in the joke until you reconcile those two things to make sense of it. So in that way, humor is something that is made through the participation of the audience. The audience's role in producing the meaning of humor is central. Okay? So, it is here when we bring those two mental models together and we figure out what is it that these two things have in common? What is it that overlaps? That is the reconciliation of the incongruity. That is the punchline. And, oh, yeah. And that is where affect comes from, positive affect in response to that. So actually, let me just give you a little example from my son. He's now 11, and he's too cool for this joke now, but when he was 5, it was his favorite joke. Okay? The joke is, hey mom, what is a tissue's favorite dance? So let's just walk through it for a second. And I know you're all guessing the punchline. Don't do that. Schema 1, a tissue, Kleenex, sneezing, blowing your nose, being sick, having a cold. Dance. Schema 2, dancing, being at a party, things related to dancing. Unrelated in your mind, until my son says, the boogie. Now all of a sudden, what have we done? Schema number 1, all about sneezing and being sick. Now in schema number 2, about dancing, they share this thing, the boogie. So when I map jokes to try to explain to students how this works, puns work very well in terms of the visual representation of this. It gets a little more complicated when we're talking about more sophisticated humor than boogie joke, but the structure is the same. So let me give you, from our friend Jimmy Fallon, a joke that he told fairly recently. We'll talk about how this works in the context of late night comedy jokes. Congrats to Chelsea Clinton, who welcomed her second child over the weekend. After the birth, Bill brought flowers while Hillary brought a focus group to help name the baby. Okay, let's think about what's going on here. And once we think about how this works, you can start to figure out why this is unique and important. We have two seemingly incompatible mental models in our mind. The first comes from the read-in of the joke. The read-in of the joke is, there's Chelsea welcoming her second child over the weekend. She had birth and Bill brought flowers. So there's a visual imagery here, right? It's very visual. You're picturing Chelsea in the hospital, and there's Bill, and look at the baby, and there's flowers and balloons, and right? And then, seemingly incompatible framework, focus group. Now, if you're familiar with focus groups, you're thinking focus groups, marketing, advertising, consumerism, maybe political strategy, maybe. So, in order to reconcile these two things, you've got to come up with the overlap. What is the overlap? That Hillary wanted her grandchild's name to increase her own favorability ratings. This is demonstrative of the fact that she is inauthentic, strategic, and manipulative, right? And this is why political jokes and political satire is so important. Because in general, more often than not, to reconcile the incongruity in political jokes is to bring to your mind a political argument. It's a proposition, okay? And that's important. It's not something as simple as a boogie, right? It is an argument. And you're thinking, does that always work? Go through late night jokes that are about politics, and you will find when they are truly satirical, right? When they're actually offering some kind of critique of people or institutions or policies, what you contribute when you listen to it, in order to make sense of it, you have to make an argument. So, one thing we know, we're going to talk about why that's so important in a second. One level of why that's important is that, well, basically just from years of research, we know that there are all these amazing positive correlates and effects of exposure to political humor, political jokes. And they include all of these things, and I will go through them. Political interest is positively associated with exposure to late night jokes, as is attention to politics. Information seeking, that is actually a causal relationship that we've identified. The more people listen to political satire jokes, the more they then subsequently go and seek out information. Now, you can understand logically how that might happen, because if you are in the process of trying to understand a joke, if your brain is not readily able to activate some of the necessary information, you might feel the need to then go out and learn more, so that you can fill in the gap and you can make sense of the joke. We also know, for those of you who have taken courses in media effects, maybe some of these things sound familiar. Agenda setting and priming, right? We know that every time our brain is asked to activate something, every time we're asked to think about something, we are increasing how salient it is in our mind, we're increasing how prevalent it is, and how likely it is to be used again. So think about it. If, over and over again, we're hearing jokes about how Hillary Clinton, for example, used a private email server, that information activated over and over again in our mind. There is evidence that exposure to late night jokes that focus on repetitive themes and caricatures and issues do set the public's agenda. They do actually shape what criteria we use to evaluate our leaders. So that's an important effect. There's also things that are, political knowledge. You can understand how, if you're going to be engaging in information seeking, you probably will acquire political knowledge. You can also acquire political knowledge directly from a joke. A lot of times the read-ins of the jokes are about current events, right? So, the United Nations met today in New York City, blah, 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 punchline. I don't have a punchline for that one. But the read into the joke actually gives you information that the United Nations met in New York. Like, that's an obvious one. We also find, probably due to some of the emotional or affective outcomes of political humor, we find increased interest and participation. People who watched Colbert when he was on Comedy Central and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, literature showed significantly higher rates of political activism and political participation among the people who watched those shows, controlling for all other kinds of third variables that could explain it. We also know that people who watch these shows are talking about politics more than people who don't. Perhaps these shows and the jokes in them are providing the wrong ingredients or an entry to discussion, right? You don't have to do anything that puts yourself out there in a polarized way. You could just say, oh, did you see the SNL parody of the debate? There's a point of entry for a fun conversation about politics that might then end up talking about issues or something substantive. And one of my favorites is this concept of political efficacy. Has anyone heard the term political efficacy? Okay, so political efficacy is one's sense that one has the capacity to understand and participate in political life. It's basically like how confident you feel in your own ability to take part. We find consistently higher rates of political efficacy among people who consume political satire. Now, the reason that matters, because you're thinking, what does that matter? So what? People have increased confidence in their own ability. Political efficacy is one of the chief drivers of voting, political participation, and all kinds of other good stuff that make democracy work. So if you can increase political efficacy, arguably, that should go on to promote all these other wonderful things. So I know you're all thinking, okay, that all sounds great. What about persuasion? That's the big question. That's why I have been called by 42 different media outlets in the past 2 months. Are these jokes changing people's minds? And what they don't want is the answer I did, which is, it depends, right? That doesn't play well on CNN. The professor says it depends. So what about persuasion? Let's talk about this, because this is where it gets, to me, it gets interesting. Persuasive effects of humor. You can think about this in 2 ways. One is what are the effects of humor on how we process messages? And what are the effects on the outcomes of that processing? So there's, you know, if you think about it as like a machine, there's the machinery itself, and then there's what comes out of the machine, okay? So there's the processing piece, and then there's the outcomes of processing. So let's start over here. We know that when you are confronted with a joke, your attention goes up compared to what your attention would be if the same kind of information were presented seriously. Obviously, you're like, this is not social science. It is. This is what I get to do for a living. This is social science. Okay? So why does attention go up? Well, because especially when you know that you've entered the state of play and you've entered the context of humor, you're ready for the payoff. Remember that affective payoff that comes at the end of the joke? That's your reward. And you know it's coming before it even starts. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to a comedy club or a stand-up comedy club, or if you've watched a stand-up comedy special on TV. You are in it to win it. You're like, okay, what's coming next? Because you know that there's an affective, emotional, positive payoff of your investment of energy and attention. That's a good thing, right? So we know attention goes up. We also know that how much your brain is chewing on the information goes up, which is a natural outcome of attention, right? You're elaborating on it, you're trying to make sense of it. As soon as that first schema is activated, you're in it. You're elaborating on it, you're getting ready to think, and you're ready to solve the riddle. You want to reconcile the humor because you want to get the joke. That's why we listen to like stand-up comedy routines. However, and this is where humor is magic. Side note. For years, satirists were assumed to be magic, to be magicians, because that is the only way that people could explain their profound effects on society and on government. Like the only way that this could possibly work is if they're magic. There must be magic. How else could this person be making fun of the king to the king's face and he still has his head? It's magic. Literally. Well, I hate to ruin it, it's not really magic, but we think we understand what might be going on. Oh, first, the outcome of all of these things up here these are natural outcomes of increased attention and elaboration. That you will tend to have enhanced recall of these things, you will tend to have these things salient in your mind and prime. Okay? However, how much you scrutinize or counter-argue the premise of what has been thrown at you goes down. Think about that for a second. Remember the joke about Chelsea Clinton at the hospital and the focus group brought in to name the baby. All of that cognitive energy dedicated to understanding that riddle and making sense of that joke operates at the expense of our scrutiny of whether or not that claim is fair, objective, right, credible, right? Because we're like, oh, I'm going to have a fun time getting the joke. This is fun. Oh, I'm thinking about, oh, that's really funny. I'm not like, what, is that fair? Is that right? I don't know if that's totally fair. I don't think that Hillary really would bring her focus group in to name babies. Right? So, they're incompatible processing goals. So we don't do them both. So the way that I think about this is resource allocation. Our resources are so allocated towards the getting of the joke and appreciating of the humor, we don't have anything left over to counter-argue the premise of the joke. My colleague Robin Nabby, this is kind of funny. Robin was doing a very similar kind of study on the other side of the country with a slightly different premise. That was people counter-argue humor less because they think it's not appropriate to counter-argue. They think, oh, this is the state of play. It's not appropriate. Different rules apply. She called this the discounting cue. It's just a joke factor. So my hypothesis is all about resources are drained. Hers is all about people just don't want to do it. And what's hilarious is that she and I both had the same doctoral dissertation advisor, but like 5 years apart. So we ended up on these totally parallel research tracks doing the same kind of thing at the same time. Well, what's kind of neat is that evidence for both processes has emerged. So both of us might be a little bit right. As I said, Heather Lamar has called this a satire processing paradox, which I like. My colleagues at the University of Amsterdam have said, I like this too, the idea that laughing and thinking are at odds with one another. Oh, that's a very nice, pithy way of explaining what I just said. Laughing and thinking are at odds with one another. So what does that mean? What it should mean is that if argument scrutiny is down, persuasion should go up, right? The jury's still out. Sorry about that. Now, we know that the capacity is there. The problem is the evidence is not there. And that could be because it is a combination of having cognitive resources drained and people being like, but it's just a joke. And if they say it's just a joke, then they're not necessarily going to be thinking about it in a way where they're going to use it to update their opinion on whatever is being made fun of. Right? So a recent set of examples, because recent examples are why I do my job. Anyone here see any segments from the recent Alfred E. Smith dinner? The Alfred E. Smith dinner is done every 4 years at, I think, the Catholic Archdiocese of New York City, and it is done as a way of bringing together presidential candidates, the nominees from the two parties, to engage in light-hearted, humorous banter at their own expense and at the other's expense. Humorous, lighthearted banter. So, just remember the Venn diagram, right? That the first schema that's activated in humor gets you thinking about one thing, and then the other thing that's activated gets you thinking about another thing, and it's when you reconcile them that an argument is made, right? Remember the Jimmy Fallon example. The argument that is made is that Hillary is inauthentic and strategic and manipulative. He never said that, though, did he? Jimmy Fallon never said, Hillary Clinton is manipulative, strategic, and inauthentic. Because if he'd said that, we would counter-argue. Be like, Jimmy, what happened? Right? Instead, we come to that conclusion, which is why it's even more powerful. And that's why we don't get angry. Because we're so busy getting it, we're not critiquing whether or not it's fair. So now, Hillary, as she admitted, used a village of comedy writers to help her construct her jokes for that evening. And you can tell because they follow this wonderful template, and they do it in a way that's like seamless. She starts by saying, Your Eminence, you do deserve great credit, Your Eminence being the cardinal? Mm-hmm. You do deserve great credit for bringing together two people who've been at each other's throats, mortal enemies, bitter foes. Now, remember what's activated right now? Where are you going in your mind? Mortal enemies, bitter foes. You're thinking Hillary and Donald, Clinton and Trump, right? I've got to ask, how did you get the governor and the mayor here together for this dinner? Right? Okay, now it's incongruity, then you have to bring it together, and the argument that's being made is that the governor and mayor of New York are bitter foes at odds with one another. Whether or not you're going to analyze that and pick that apart and judge whether or not that's fair, that's not even going to happen. Because your brain is so surprised and delighted at the fun that it just went through to get that joke. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Donald Trump was booed at this dinner. Now, if you are booed as you are telling jokes, that would seem to suggest that whatever it is that I just talked about is wrong. Because booing suggests argument scrutiny and counter-argumentation. If you are booing, you have not suspended the thinking of your audience. If they are booing, they are not laughing. Right? Okay. The read-in of Donald Trump's joke. They got the first one, they got the boo. Hillary is so corrupt. Boo. I'm not even kidding, that's when they all started to boo. Oh, this is off the rails. Commission. How corrupt do you have to be to get kicked off the Watergate Commission? Okay. So let's think about this for a second. When political satire jokes work, it is the audience contribution that brings the proposition or the argument to the people. Where's the argument or proposition of this joke? What is the proposition of this joke?
The lead.
It's the lead!
Though I have to say, you retelling it actually is now very funny. You have a whole other layer of irony on this, not being a joke. So.
Right, it's funny because it
Hard
doesn't
not to
work
laugh.
right, because it's made wrong. Okay, so but think about it. That first schema that's activated now is the argument. I'm like, oh, poor Donald, you should have called somebody to help him. He doesn't understand how this works. This isn't how this works. So, in other words, your argument scrutiny is not going to be disrupted because the thing that he's saying that is offensive, he says explicitly at the lead-in. You know what I'm saying? When I watched this, I was like, oh my gosh, he didn't read my study from 2008. Okay, so that really is sort of the psychology of how humor works in a very big nutshell. And now, irony, which is its own beast. Because irony also has incongruity within it. But the incongruity is much more abstract. Irony is when you describe what is real as though it is ideal. Like a joke like, for example, oh good, police are killing African Americans on the street. This is what we want. Right? That is describing the real as though it is ideal. Like, oh good. Right? That's kind of something that Stephen Colbert would often do. Or describing what ought to be as though it is what is. Like, well, of course everyone has their fair share and there are no people starving in America. Okay. Either way, you are inverting the meaning. Either way, you are saying the opposite of what you actually mean. So the literal and the intended meanings are at odds. So the best example of this in recent history really is Stephen Colbert's character that he played on the Colbert Report on Comedy Central. Because he played the part of conservative pundit, even though he himself is a progressive. So somebody who studies satire and irony a lot, Simpson argues that irony, more than any other form, is the quintessential vehicle for political satire. It is the concept of irony more than any other device which tends to be regarded as the central mechanism in the production of satire. And you can kind of understand why that is based on the definition of irony here. If you are trying to criticize the status quo, criticize institutions, criticize cultural practices, criticize social norms, you could do so explicitly, and it would be very contentious. Or you could describe what is as though it's what ought to be, or you could describe what ought to be as though it is what is, with a wink and a nod, and hope that everybody really understands what it is you really mean. Well, therein lies the rub, because not everyone does understand what irony means. Specifically one kind. They're both beasts, but one kind. So Burgers and colleagues deconstructed irony and said, you know, there's two different kinds. One kind of ironic text is explicitly evaluative. It says, I love this thing. And the listener knows, oh wait, they hate that thing. Okay? That's easier, because we get it, especially if we know the speaker and we understand their point of view. Like Colbert. Perfect example. Folks, I love capital punishment. It sends a clear message. We as a society think it is depraved to take a human life, and to prove it, we're going to kill you. Explicitly evaluative. He says, I love capital punishment. You know his point of view, you understand what he is here for, and you know he means he hates it. And then there's this other stuff. Implicitly evaluative. Where the text does not say, one way or another, explicitly where it stands on an issue, and you have to figure it out. The Onion has reposted this same article over and over and over, unfortunately because they can. After every mass shooting, they post the same article with the headline, "There's no way to prevent this," says the only nation where this regularly happens. that is implicitly evaluative because it does not come out and say whether or not it's good or bad. We know what it means. We know what it means because if we're the only nation where this regularly happens, then there must be a way to prevent it, given that it doesn't happen anywhere else. Okay? So, as I have sort of suggested, irony is a beast. It is a beast to understand in the brain. There are actually studies that show that certain kinds of individuals literally do not process irony. They only process it literally. Okay? It's associated with activity in the right frontal lobe. That's my left frontal lobe. This is my right frontal lobe. So this is like a unique form of cognitive processing. It requires multiple levels of processing. You have to reconcile what's being said. You have to understand the intention of the author. You have to flip it upside down and then figure out what's the main argument. So therefore, it's often misunderstood. So after being asked for years, why is satire so liberal? I then started doing research into political psychology and certain psychological traits. And I started thinking, maybe it's because irony, which is so complex and so often used in satire, maybe it privileges one kind of brain over another. So, is it possible that irony is so complicated and ambiguous, its meaning is so open-ended, that it might privilege people who are high in need for cognition, which means they have sort of an enjoyment of thinking and solving problems, and might it also privilege those who tolerate ambiguity well? This is the opposite of another trait called need for closure. Some people are high in tolerance for ambiguity. They're okay in uncertain situations. They feel comfortable when things are unpredictable. They can go into a room not knowing anyone and it's fine. They don't need a firm routine. All of these are part of that scale. And what's totally fascinating is that a ton of work over the past decade has traced these links between political ideology and those traits. Conservatives tend to be lower in need for cognition and lower in tolerance for ambiguity. And it is something that these political psychologists explain through the fact that conservatives have what is called a higher mortality salience, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. Mortality is death. Salience is on the top of your mind. Conservatives tend to be more cognizant of and thinking about their own death than liberals. I don't know why, but this just is. So, as part of that, conservatives might also tend to be more likely to be surveying the scene for threats, to be cognizant of uncertainty and threats, and want to minimize uncertainty and threats to a greater degree than liberals. Kind of interesting. So that kind of explains the root of the tolerance for ambiguity link. So I thought, okay, irony is so ambiguous. Irony requires all these mental gymnastics just to get a joke. Is it possible that these psychological traits are the reason why all the satire that we see is coming from the left? So I decided to do a study, because that's what I do. Oh, these are just some examples of famous people who make jokes, all of whom are communists. I mean liberals. Okay? Like historically, like it just comes from the left. And everyone says, oh, but Fox News put together the half-hour comedy hour, which failed after 13 episodes. Okay, so this somehow is this rhetorical tool of the left. So let's explore this. So the model really is it that political ideology increases irony appreciation through these traits? Is it possible that that's what's going on? So I did an experiment that I can talk about in detail later, because it's tedious. Basically, I created two different kinds of humorous stimuli with the help of comedians, don't worry, like real comedians. And we stripped all of the content of political references altogether. We only took current events that were about consumer news, science, random current events that had nothing to do with politics. And we made one version that was ironic, where the speaker had a point of view but said the opposite of what they really meant. And the other, which we call like hyperbole or exaggerated, where they said what they meant, but they did it like in a heightened way. If you want to think about exaggeration or hyperbole-based humor, has anyone here ever heard Dane Cook?
Yeah.
She's like, yes, he's funny. Okay. Dane Cook is like the king of hyperbole and exaggeration-based humor. He says exactly what he means, but he does it in really colorful terms. He's like a tall guy. He uses big motions. He's very much about exaggeration and hyperbole. But there's no inverted meaning. He doesn't say the opposite of what he means. He says exactly what he means, but he like explodes it out. So those were the two conditions, because I thought, okay, if all of this can be predicted through need or tolerance for ambiguity and need for cognition, conservatives should be more appreciative of a kind of humor that doesn't involve that ambiguity and unpacking, but is just explicit, right? Maybe conservatives would be more appreciative of a hyperbole. Well, in my sample, conservatives were less appreciative of both. So this is why I still have a job, because I have more work to do. So here, the appreciation for the ironic stimuli was significantly lower among conservatives than liberals, and the appreciation for the exaggerated stimuli was lower, I mean, not at a level where a journal would accept that difference, but it's still interesting. Okay? So, wait, let me give another piece to this here. The other piece to this is that, in terms of explaining why this happened, you know, those psychological traits, how much did those psychological traits predict this? Turns out, especially for the appreciation of irony, a lot of that variance was explained through need for cognition. It did perform in the way expected. Tolerance for ambiguity did not. And I had most of my eggs in that basket, so that was a bit weird. But it does appear that conservatives, who then also happen to be lower in need for cognition, then are less appreciative of irony. And that did mediate that relationship. Next, I'm going to switch gears to get to how irony is particularly problematic in social media contexts, which you have probably experienced in your own lives, by people misunderstanding your intention of things that you have said. So, there are a bunch of linguists, many of whom are from Western Europe, who write papers upon papers of the role of irony markers. By the way, that was one. Quotation marks? Irony markers? That's very meta. Anyway. Irony markers are meta-communicative clues that alert the reader to the fact that something is ironic. So, if you speak in a certain way, you might cue to the audience that you're, you know, joking. Quotation marks do that. When you're texting someone, winky face. You look so fat in that outfit. Winky face. You know, okay, thanks. All right. JK, just kidding. We get it. The problem is, a lot of the spaces that we live in now are these weird hybrid digital spaces where there are no irony markers. We don't have those cues. So I want to just mention, there's a lot of work on digital information spaces. Henry Jenkins has done a lot of work on this, talking about the migratory behavior of users and audiences, where they don't really come into like entertainment or communication experiences through a main door. You know, you used to like tune in to a show at 7 o'clock, it would start, there'd be an opening credit scene, okay, here we go, and now we're here. And now it's a comedy show, we know that everything here is funny, good. Even with websites. You used to go to a homepage of a website. You go to the homepage, you do the search, you find what you're looking for, and then you're in the website. Homepage entry doesn't really happen anymore because we all go to websites through the direct links offered to us through Twitter, Facebook, right? People send you a story, you're not going to the homepage of the New York Times. When's the last time you went to the, it might be your homepage, I don't know. But usually, you are just going directly to the story. The same is true for all kinds of text that we access online. There are all these side doors to entry. What that means is that all of those big cues and clues that would tell us, this is a funny place, this is where funny things happen, we miss them. They don't exist anymore. So Trevor Noah had this wonderful quote. Now I know that people saying that he's not as funny as Jon Stewart, and I tend to agree. However, he did have this brilliant observation in talking with Terry Gross on Fresh Air a few months back. He was asked about some tweets that he had delivered that had been really scrutinized and criticized. He said, this is why comedy has existed for so long in a safe space, and that is a comedy club. And now with the change in social media and sharing videos and sound bites, we now live in a world where people are part of conversations that they originally were not. You're now overhearing everything that everybody's talking about, and you're not part of the conversation. What's fascinating to me about this is the idea that, yeah, the comedy club used to be the safe, sacred space. And not only was it a safe, sacred space, comedy clubs are where? Underground. They're dark, they're underground. You enter that space and you understand that everything that happens in that space is delivered through a different lens. But now, each of those individual jokes is taken out of that space, out of its natural context, put online with no markers, tweeted out, and you have no more control. It's not yours anymore. The audience can decide to invert its meaning or not. You don't get to tell them what to do with it. You're not there. It's disembodied from you, right? That to me is so fascinating, and social media are struggling to figure out how to deal with it. For example, Twitter has a rule that if you are putting out ironic, fake stories, first of all, you cannot co-opt someone else's identity without saying explicitly on your profile that it is a parody account. That is part of its legal terms, that you have to put it in there so that people know when they go to your Twitter page and they can immediately understand your intention, the intention of your communication through how you've labeled yourself. Then, Facebook was experimenting with this because this was about 2 years ago. People were getting really angry because stories were showing up in people's news feeds that were fake news, and people were sharing them as though they were real. From The Onion to whatever, they were sharing them as though they were real. Including like politicians sharing stories, not understanding the ironic meaning of the story and sharing it as though it was literal. Okay? And people were like, that's from The Onion. That's The Onion? No. So Facebook says, we need to tag this stuff as satire. To which the user said, we are not children. You don't need to tell us this is funny now. People got really mad. They didn't want to be told what to do. So then Facebook's like, okay, people hate this. They don't like this at all. What we're going to do is we're going to take away the satire tag. But we're going to allow people to report stories. You know when you go to a story, you can report it? For a long time, there was a reporting option. You could report it as a hoax or as fake. And then all of that feedback would go back to Facebook, and stories or sources that were repeatedly tagged as hoaxes or fake then got, what do they call it? Less privileged distribution through the Facebook algorithm. Translation, they didn't show up in your feed anymore. Okay? So I talked with the guy who runs this one not that funny satire site called The Daily Current. The not that funny part, that's my editorial commentary. He has gotten in tons of trouble because a lot of his stories are then flagged as hoaxes. And he got really angry because as soon as Facebook changed their algorithm and allowed people to call out things that were fake, all of a sudden, traffic to his webpage from Facebook decreased by like 95%. And he said, this is censorship. And I said, but you recognize that Facebook would say that's not censorship. That just means that the users think you're not funny, you're a hoax. He said, it's censorship. However, within 4 months, something else happened. His traffic was back up from Facebook, so that was good. And if you notice, the time period corresponded with this new thing. Remember when this showed up and you're like, what? I just want to like something. Why do I have all these faces I need to stick my finger on? Now I can love it or wow it or cry it or anger. Okay. So what happened was Facebook decided, rather than having people report things as hoaxes, we will just be less sort of punitive. We will judge whether or not something is satirical by whether or not it makes people angry or make a laughy face. So as much as you think that you were just expressing your own individualistic response, you're not. You're giving data to Facebook to help shape their algorithm about what they think is or is not satire. So when you are a satire publication, you better hope that the people reading your stuff give it the happy laughy face. Because if they're making the angry red face, you are going to get less privileged distribution through the Facebook algorithm. Interesting, no? Yeah. And all of this is because of a lack of irony markers, and because irony is so complicated for the brain to untangle. And the final example that I'll give you of this, brand new, and I tweeted at this guy and said, your tweet is going to be a part of my talk on Friday. He's like, oh, that sounds interesting. So you may have heard that some of the leaked emails from Clinton's email talked about or requested oversamples. Okay? So people from within the Clinton campaign said, we need you, polling agency, to oversample African Americans. And then the Trump campaign shared that information and said, see, they are making phony polls. To which every statistician anywhere said, you need oversamples in order to have statistical power to look at meaningful relationships within subpopulations where you don't get enough people within your actual survey. But we're not that interesting, so no one listens to us. So, this guy put out this ironic conspiracy theorist guide to polling terminology. Number one, oversampling. Interviewing extra Clinton voters to skew your poll. Weighting. Making Trump voters count less than Clinton voters. Quotas. Caps on the number of Trump voters in your poll. Now I read this and I'm laughing and laughing. Oh, this is really smart and funny. And then I'm like, oh, shoot. Why am I saying oh, shoot? This is the audience engagement portion of the presentation. Why am I saying oh, shoot? Because people are going to, no, it's not real. Oh, yeah. But it could be. It could be. It's not. He's being ironic. But then I start realizing it is being shared as literal. And guess what? Nick Gurovich had wonderful intentions of playfully making fun of conspiracy theorists who don't understand polling. But now all of a sudden, his tweet is being shared as confirmation that these conspiracy theories are real.
Leaked memo.
What?
It's a leaked memo.
It is. This comes from some lockbox from the Clinton campaign. Okay, you understand? So I'm like, oh, man, this is funny. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. There are no markers. There's no irony markers. His account is not a parody account. He's like a pollster guy. You know, people, oh, see, he's a pollster. This is the real deal. Irony is a beast. Okay, so thinking about where to take this in the future, because irony is so complicated to understand, I have been increasingly interested in this concept of meta humor. You may have heard of people such as Schumer, Dave Chappelle, Sarah Silverman, Louis C.K. These are people who often play the role of someone who is sexist, racist, xenophobic, as a way of ironically criticizing racism, sexism, xenophobia, right? They play the part of that person to ironically present a critique. My fear is that, especially in the context of digital spaces, where everyone comes into everything through the side door, without the proper context or cues, I think a lot of people are being exposed to some of these sketches or segments, and they're taking away whatever they want to take away from it. They might be reading it as exaggeration rather than irony. So I say this not because I think that they ought to do things differently, but I do think that comics need to be aware that if they're using their texts as persuasive rhetorical devices, they need to know that once they let go of it and send it into the world, it's not theirs. Once they let go of it, it can be recontextualized by anyone else for any other reason. Another thing that I'm interested in is the promise of analogy and hyperbole, and exaggeration. When things are not ironic, when things are presented literally in an exaggerated way, I think there's real promise there for persuasion and framing. John Oliver is the king of hyperbole and exaggeration and analogy. Rarely is John Oliver ironic. And people are always like, are you sure? And I say, go back and watch his show. He says exactly what he means, and he gives these really wonderful unpacking analogies to sort of heighten the phenomenon, and that really illuminates whatever it is he's talking about. And we have found lots of benefits of exposure to his show on learning about complicated issues, from net neutrality to super PACs to payday lenders, and he just did this amazing segment on the role of prescription drug companies in opioid addiction in the US. I mean, there's some real opportunity there for knowledge gain and persuasion. And just in general, one of the things that I would love to do, this seems quaint right now, 11 days out, but think about how these ideas can be applied to be able to bridge those rhetorical gaps that exist between the left and the right. Because there are times, I mean, maybe in talking with family members or old friends, you realize not only do we have different political points of view, we speak differently, and we often misunderstand the language of the other. And I think that might be due to these sort of inherent differences. But we can work to bridge those. So that's sort of my idealistic take from here. So I just want to say thank you so much to the Pockrass Committee. This has been such an honor to be here and talk about you. And thank you Penn State and the College of Communications and the Department of Film, Video, and Media Studies. There's a lot of language and words in your department name. So thank you so much, and I would love to answer whatever questions you have.
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
This is kind of self-disclosure, so I don't use Twitter that much. But I got on Twitter and I searched for Donald Trump, and there was this picture of these two young, look like college students, very fussy, and it was like, thank you for the, thanks for the support, and I was like, oh my God, I was exactly like the person who's believing the Onion is real, and it wasn't real, and I missed the whole thing that was parody, and I like to think I'm high on heat for cognition, but I'm wondering how much the change in the actual sort of political climate can contribute to confusion, because frankly, I can imagine now Trump posting something like that, and
Yeah.
like when I see it, when I read the regular news, it could be an Onion piece sometimes, like the real.
No, I know.
So I was wondering what you thought
That's a
about
great point. I don't know. I do feel like, I've taught political communication for a long time, and I've spent years talking to my students about how political communications by campaigns and politicians are rarely from the politicians themselves. They're curated. There's handlers and operatives that do everything, and Trump has put everything that I've ever taught my students in the wastebasket, because he has autonomy over what he puts out and when he puts it out. And sometimes it has typos, and sometimes it's missing a comma, and sometimes which is something that you would think that you would not see. So I do think that there's something about that campaign that lends itself, especially because he'll do things to be outrageous on purpose to get attention, and it works. Like, he is the king of Twitter. And he'll tell you. He'll tell you. And he is the king of Twitter. And that plays well in that context, and because of that, I do think it is increasingly difficult, particularly when it's something satirizing something he would say, to know if it's satire or not. You know? On the other side, though, I do think that you can tell pretty quickly, because just as Hillary brought in a focus group to name her grandchild, Hillary Clinton has a village filtering her and overseeing her tweets and all of her campaign messages. So.
I always think when people say, there aren't any conservative comedians or anything, I always mention, well, there's one institution that's been there for 20 years, South Park.
Yes.
I think South Park satirizes the left better than any other initiative. What do you think? Not more conservative comedians, quote-unquote comedians, adopt that model of making comedy at the expense of the left? I don't know.
That is a good question. And I know when they did Team America, World Police, that film, that was the same kind of idea. It was the same, it was conservative satire aimed at liberal ideology.
Right.
I'm not sure, I really don't know, because that was the one sort of successful model of that. I don't know, that's a
Probably
good
the only
question.
one, right?
Yeah, I mean, people will always bring up individual instances of comedians who are conservative, but they don't have the reach of like a South Park. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
Well, everybody has a sense of humor.
No.
Well, conservatives don't get Spinal Tap. It's a pretty universal trait. What is therefore a marker of evolutionary fitness? What are your thoughts on why that is?
Well, let me think about that. First of all, not everyone has it. I didn't show you that because I didn't want to make enemies. But not everyone does have it, and there are some strong predictors of it. There are literally people who, when you say, would you strongly agree or strongly disagree that people who tell jokes, can make a situation more pleasant? And there are people who will strongly disagree with that. There are people who will say that people who make jokes are a waste of time. I'm like, I hope I'm not friends with that. But that's just out there. Well, and in terms of the evolutionary piece, that's a bold contention. I think surely in terms of as a social lubricant, obviously it would make you more fit. But I have to say, if anything, sense of humor, and having a sense of humor and having that trait be something that helps you function in the world, that is a sign of a very evolved society that you live in. Because I was telling you guys yesterday, I can imagine living in a world in which people who have senses of humor and who are always making jokes are really destructive to your ability to survive, right? Like, think about when you're like at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You don't want someone who's high in tolerance for ambiguity. You want someone who's going to take the spear and not think and kill the tiger so you have dinner. You know what I'm saying? You don't want someone who's going to make jokes. So I do think that it's a sign of sort of where we are culturally. I also think it's a sign that some certain kinds of people don't have it and don't appreciate it. It's a sign of where they think we are culturally. Yeah.
Actually, I was going to ask about this in terms of uncertainty avoidance, like from Hofstede.
Yes.
Because it seemed to me that you're at a low uncertainty avoidance country, and also the Amsterdam study.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think that it's related to some of those cultural variables?
I am sure. The notion of, the need to reduce uncertainty as being, that's sort of where these things come from. And that's sort of where tolerance for ambiguity stems from, is that you don't have a huge need for uncertainty reduction. You're like, it's cool. Let's just hang out around all these threats and not worry about it. It's all good. That really, that is what this is about. And that fascinates me. And I do think that also points to some interesting cross-cultural differences in what we find. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I just was wondering if anyone was working in that cross-cultural space, because it does
No, but I will now. I will.
So
following on that, do you think then that like some of these conservative humorists, we can call it a cable guy humorist, or
Yes.
you might be a redneck guy humorist, but what they're doing is foreclosing identification with the people that they're lampooning as a way of reducing the people that threaten
That's
their
interesting.
community?
That's interesting. I have actually, you'll appreciate this, I'm glad you asked this, I have tweeted extensively with Larry the Cable Guy. And it happened because somebody asked me online, like, okay, you know, I've heard about your work on this or that, how do you explain Larry the Cable Guy? And I say, well, you know, he goes against type. And what we do know is that, you know, no, I said, what did I say? I said something like, maybe he's very unhappy because he has such cognitive dissonance all the time. I was joking. And then Larry the Cable Guy tweeted back, said, I am the happiest person you will ever meet. I was like, Larry, I'm so sorry. So, but what came through was that he does what he does to try to create a kinship and a connection with these people who he feels that he shares his cultural heritage with. I think he also feels like the burn of political correctness, because there is a genre of humor that is not in vogue anymore. And he still holds on to it. And his audiences still like it. So it works for them. But if you notice, he doesn't really have that sort of mainstream appeal. Like, you can find him in certain places, on certain channels at certain times.
How does mean comedy then relate to that? Stuff that is really vicious.
Like alt-right? Well, I just say that because I got tweeted at extensively from them, and it was mean. I don't know. We talk a lot about punching up and punching down. And so liberals often punch up, right? They're always punching up at those in positions of power at the establishment. And conservatives will punch down. I don't know that I've heard that. I don't think that totally gels with the data. I cannot explain mean comedy.
So humor is a way for us to deal with socially sensitive issues through positive emotions, right? Of
Yep.
laughter and amusement.
Yep.
In your own research, where do you find that people draw the line in terms of, well, this is just not funny anymore, right? Because that's a cognitive choice that we made. So we resolve the two schema, and we get the argument, but we choose
But not everything can be brought into the state of play.
Right.
Now, I have this conversation a lot with my husband, because my husband is of the mind that any kind of jokes about the Holocaust or mass genocide, no matter what the point of the joke is, they are not funny. Not just they're not funny, but like he won't do the read-in, right? The second you start the read-in, he's like, I'm out. And I try to explain to him, like, how do you explain all my friends from Israel who tell the most gallows-oriented jokes about their dead grandparents, and they do it as a way of coping? And I'm like, do you think that's okay? And for my husband, he says for him it's not. And I'm like, yeah, but it's their history. Don't they get to claim what's okay and what's not? He said, they can, but I don't want to hear it. I think that it's very intimate. I think it's about what you need for your purposes, like what you need to be able to make sense of your own history and your own cultural background. I think that we, as a culture, have determined there are some things that are just off limits. And I think that that's part of the tension between the left and the right now. I mean, there was an amazing conversation between Jerry Seinfeld and I think it was Seth Meyers, maybe? Jerry Seinfeld and Chris Rock are friends. And they both have come out and said, we will not do college tours anymore because we are so sick of these college students telling us that we can't make fun of this or that and that microaggressions are hurting them. You know, Jerry Seinfeld was like, I'm out, I'm not doing it anymore. And he said, he gave this example that, you know, he made some gesture of someone sweeping through their phone. Did you see this?
Yes,
Yeah,
I saw that.
I can tell it because you're laughing already, and I'm not being funny.
I'm
So,
sorry.
no, that's good. Okay. So he made this gesture of people being like, look, these are all my closest friends in my phone. He's like, well, I give you your closest friends, you're scrolling through them like you're the gay king of France. And people are like, oh, yes, okay. And he's like, what? But I do think that as a culture, we are moving in this direction where we are very sensitive to issues of marginalized groups, and we're sensitive to the idea that we have this shared history, and what can we do rhetorically to make people feel more comfortable. But you can understand that there is a backlash where people are like, are you kidding me? That's not over the line. No one's getting hurt. So that is a debate that is active right now, and is a tension that is active right now. Yes?
And we increasingly see a lot of political humor get into the evening news, like in the mainstream, like the newscasters there. Do you think like the political humor will help us understand the news event or blur the line between entertainment and serious news coverage?
Good question. So when I think about this, I actually invoke a lot of Matt's work with media economics and what are the incentives actually for the news industry to include these sketches. I really do not think that news programming is including SNL sketches and Jon Stewart segments because they think that it's going to illuminate some issue for their viewers. They do it because they are profit-driven and they can use it as pre-existing content that is already funny, that is already going to generate attention, and it's easy, and it's quick, and it's done, and it's fair use, so they can comment upon it. So I'm much more cynical about why they do it. In terms of the effects of that, I think that, particularly thinking about the 2008 election, there was a lot of news coverage of the Palin caricatures by Tina Fey. And there was a lot of news coverage that operated from the assumption that these parodies are shaping public opinion of Palin. And in terms of influence, I think that just by the mere fact that they said it was shaping public opinion, I do think that it sort of made it so. I think that it started to blend those two. So that was something that was quite salient. But they don't ever do it for the public good, I don't think. Good question. Yes?
I know you kind of touched on it earlier with a few other questions, but certain types of humor are kind of falling out of good graces with the public because of certain groups being like, no, that's not funny anymore. I find that offensive. Do you think that it is going to lead to like a certain kind of censorship? Well, maybe not outright censorship, but like the idea that oh, you can't say that it's 2016. Like for example, like George Carlin in my book is kind of like great equalizer.
Right.
He makes fun of both sides as much as he could.
Yes.
I don't think he would be nearly as popular today as he was 20 years ago because of the controversial things he would say. So do you think that it is going to lead to like some kind of censorship?
Before it leads to censorship, I really think it's going to lead to a significant backlash, which we already see. So I am a professor at the University of Delaware, where my campus just hosted the alt-right guy Milo, Yana Kamalokovas, he is the guy who orchestrated the Twitter campaign against Leslie Jones, and he got banned from Twitter. He's like the first and only person to ever get banned from Twitter. So the college Republicans at the University of Delaware decided that he was the guy they wanted to bring to campus. So you can imagine how the campus felt about that. That was good times. Just happened on Monday. Good times. So he came to campus, and his whole thing is that language about microaggressions and people being offended has gotten so out of hand that he is a reaction to that. What he did, and this is kind of smart when you think about it, he calls his show by all these different really provocative names. One of them is, he calls it, his show he called Trannies Are Gay. So he had all of these posters made up, and so that the day of the event, our campus was covered in these giant color posters that just said trannies are gay and that transvestites are mentally ill, all over campus, as the promotional material for his show. And honestly, where did he come from? I do think that he came from that sense that at some point, enough is enough. At some point, a microaggression is so micro, it's no longer an aggression. And I think that he has been able to really get a following of people who are like, yeah, enough's enough. We should be able to say what we want. So before I think it'll turn to total censorship, I think there's this backlash.
We actually had a speaker like that last semester with Matt Shapiro coming over.
Yeah.
And he was hosted by the college Republicans, I believe. And there was a huge counter protest outside that actually tried to interrupt his event.
Yeah.
So we kind of had something similar to that.
That's interesting. Well, you find it interesting that on our campus, we're trying to figure out how do we deal with this? Like, how do we protect our marginalized groups and make sure that they feel safe and comfortable, whatever. And people are like, oh, we should have a mass protest outside. Well, if you read the stuff that Milo writes, that's what he wants. So instead, 27 RSOs got together and hosted a unity fair at the same time as counter-programming. And the second that the tickets went on sale for Milo's event, half of them were purchased by people who then ripped them up, put them in the trash, and didn't attend. So he spoke to a half-full auditorium. There were no counter-protests, and the entire student body was at the unity fair. So that's that was kind of an interesting approach. But we're in this space where we're navigating what's funny and what's not, and who gets to decide what's appropriate and what isn't.
Kind of on that same train of thought, in the time where everything is so polarized and people saying change, how important is it that comedians like Louis C.K. and Joe Rogan and Bill Burr are still so popular, even though they are kind of more of a modern day Carlin equal opportunity offender?
Well, if you notice, though, even Louis C.K. of late has gotten real blowback. I don't know if you recall, in the past year he hosted SNL, and he made a joke about pedophilia. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? He made a joke, and he was crucified because it was deemed just too over the line. I think it's also a function of the fact that he wasn't doing like an HBO special. It was SNL, NBC, mainstream audience, and they were not okay with that, and neither were the sponsors of the show. So I think that the role that they play and who they're allowed to be is changing. You also watch his show now, Louis, is on FX. As we get these more fragmented spaces, you're going to see some of these people that are doing things that are more cutting edge. They're always going to have a home because they can go to like a niche, little fragmented space, and the people who want to see them can go there. So I don't think they're going to disappear. Yes?
So on the one hand, we have this idea that humor is harmless. That the jester can mock the king without getting his head chopped off, but nobody else can. On the other hand, we're seeing all these examples of humor being treated as really dangerous. And so how do you reconcile those two things? Which is harmless or dangerous, or is that the tension?
Right, and I think that in that tension is sort of how we navigate who we are as a culture and who we want to be and what our social norms are and what's okay. For some reason, I always end up using the metaphor of yoga. Yoga is a practice where does anyone here do yoga? I don't want to talk about yoga. Has anyone here ever done yoga? Thank you, okay. Yoga is a practice where there are two competing forces that you're activating at the same time. And so you're pulling one way and pushing another way. You're going up and you're going down. It's all happening at the same time. And it's a struggle, and you're trying to stay still. And every once in a while you find a sweet spot. But you're never going to stay there because so it's in that negotiation where the practice is. That negotiation is the practice. So I do think that in these negotiations, that is where we define who we are. In these conversations about what is okay, what's not okay. In the news articles saying, was it okay for Louis C.K. to make a reference like that? Is it okay for Milo to come to Delaware's campus and put these things up there? That in that conversation is where we define ourselves. I don't think that there is an answer to, are they powerful or are they harmless? I think we decide as a culture where that line is, and it's always moving.
Can I ask just about the liberal-conservative difference? If you take it out of the political context, is humor just more common among progressive regardless if it's political humor or not?
Yes.
Does it come down to need for, I mean, you think a lot of it's need for cognition?
I don't know. But, so my colleague Allison Dagnes wrote a book called A Conservative Walks into a Bar. And she was asking the same question that I'm asking, but she's not a cognitive psychologist. She's sort of a qualitative ethnographer. So she went into New York and interviewed all of these political comedians and writers and stand-up comics to try to figure out, like, what are they like? What makes them tick? And what she found was really kind of confirmation of these she wasn't measuring these psychological traits, but what she was finding was that these are people who are very comfortable not knowing where their next paycheck comes from. What does that sound like? These are people who are outside of society's sort of mainstream expectations of what grown-ups do for a living, right? They have completely crazy schedules. Some nights they work from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Some mornings they're going to a Holiday Inn in Pockrass, Delaware to perform. So they have lifestyles. There are lifestyles that are inherent in the life of a comic that actually, if you think about it, map on pretty well to that ambiguity piece. So I've been kind of interested in that. And the evidence that I've seen does suggest that not only appreciation of humor, but also one's sense of how much they engage in humor as a coping mechanism, that is higher among political progressives. Now's where I just make stuff up. I mean, I've been making it all up, but really make stuff up. I do think that there is something, progressives tend to be more secular. I do think that there is a kind of comfort that progressives can get through humor and through humorous inversions that maybe they're not getting from other places, whereas conservatives score higher on religiosity scales, and they might get some kind of comfort and peace in that. So who knows? Maybe it's where we find comfort. That was the improviser making things up.
One more question?
I just wanted to ask, kind of a McCoolin, you know, everybody gets into these language games where the payoff is the buzz, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the persuasion is not toward an argument, but more toward more buzz.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that has any impact on whether or not this really translates. So if people, say for instance, are not skeptical when they're coming at these things, if we're just, you know, more buzz, might
Will
that-
it destroy democracy and the republic?
That-
Yes,
that
it will.
would-
Yes. Yes. I got to tell you honestly, the thing that scares me the most, and it sounds like it's tangential to what I study, but I see it as very much related, is belief in conspiracy theories. And because it is kind of related, according to Facebook, it is. According to Facebook and Twitter, it's related. So that kind of sense that, like, just through sheer repetition, something becomes so and becomes more salient and dominant, that then triumphs and becomes real or becomes truth. That scares the Jesus out of me. And that comes from the left and the right. Conspiracy theories are rampant on the left and the right in these fringe groups. And that, I think, is devastating.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr.